Mohsen, I want to widen it out a little bit. Obviously, this election happening not in a vacuum regionally. We had US President Donald Trump in Riyadh as these results were announcing with some very tough anti-Iranian rhetoric. How's this playing out?
Well, I think in the press conference that Dr. Marandi referred to, President Rouhani said something that I think is very wise, and that is, he said Iran is not going to react to the announcements or to the speech by President Trump, because in his judgment, American policy toward Iran is under review, and Iran is going to wait to see what that policy is going to be. Having said that, though, it seems to me that President Trump is making a radical departure from President Obama, in that President Obama was trying to find a sort of a compromise to push Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two major powers in the region, to reach a compromise. He was trying to stay more or less neutral in the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It seems to me that now President Trump has decided to side with Saudi Arabia and with its Gulf allies against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think if this becomes the official strategy and policy of the United States, I'm afraid we are not going to be able to see a more stable region that is already beset by civil wars, sectarianism, failed states, and terrorism. Iran is a major player in that region, and rather than confronting Iran and isolating Iran, I think a much more prudent and a much more peaceful way to address these problems is to engage Iran as the 6 global powers did, and were able to reach an agreement that ended decades of hostility between Iran and major global powers over Iran's nuclear program.
Well, I'm glad you said all that, because I want to now play US President Donald Trump in Riyadh and then get your reaction off the back of that.
For decades, Iran has fueled the fires of sectarian conflict and terror. It is a government that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing the destruction of Israel, death to America, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this very room. Until the Iranian regime is willing to be a partner for peace, all nations of conscience must work together to isolate Iran, deny it, funding for terrorism, cannot do it, and pray for the day when the Iranian people have the just and righteous government they so richly deserve.
Ahmad, your reaction to that?
Well, despite, regardless of who won the elections in Iran, Tehran and Washington were on a path to more confrontation rather than cooperation in the near future. And we are talking about President Rouhani's win, but let's just also remember that when it comes to Iran's major foreign policy or regional actions, it is the Revolutionary Guards who is designing and implementing those strategies under close supervision of the Supreme Leader. So Rouhani's role is very limited, no matter what he wants to do. And we already see signs of tension between the Iranian-backed forces in Syria and Iraq, and also the US military in the region. And we would see more of that in the coming months. And in addition to that, President Trump has made it clear that he may want to stick to the Iranian deal, but he would increase pressure on Iran and has already imposed new sanctions on Iranian individuals and entities associated with Iran's ballistic missile program, and also regional support for terrorism. And that itself also throws the future of the nuclear deal in doubt.
Mohammad Marandi, you were smiling when you listened to the Donald Trump in Riyadh there. I presume you're not entirely happy by what the new US president said.
Well, to be honest, I'm indifferent. The U.S. president obviously was not being honest. The Iranians have never spoke about annihilating any country. If he's alluding to the Israeli regime, Iran is basically, has always said its policy is that it does not recognize the moral legitimacy of Zionism, and therefore the Israeli regime is not morally legitimate, just like apartheid South Africa. But beyond that, I think it's obvious to your viewers that the countries that support terrorism in this region are in fact those very same countries that gathered, the President of the United States went to, and a number of the countries that gathered there along with him. We know from the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that regional countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and unfortunately the current Turkish president, they helped create the extremist groups called ISIS. This is the U.S. National Defense Intelligence Agency. We also know from the WikiLeaks documents that Hillary Clinton knew that up to 2014, the United States knew that Qatar and Saudi Arabia were funding ISIS. And also we know that from the leaked audio clip that Kerry said to Syrian opposition groups that the U.S. allowed ISIS to advance upon the Syrian capital in order to put pressure on Assad. So when we talk about extremism, we are talking about the Saudi Arabian destruction of Yemen, the siege of the people, forcing people into hunger in that country. On the other hand, we have Iran, one of the few countries in the whole region that has elections and meaningful elections. It is one of those forces that is aiding countries in the fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We know Al-Qaeda in Yemen just recently, the head of Al-Qaeda admitted that it is fighting alongside American-backed forces. So it's really silly for anyone to take what Trump is saying seriously.
Saudi Arabia does, and let's just listen to Saudi Arabia's foreign minister coming off the back of Donald Trump in Riyadh.
With regard to the re-election of Rouhani, this is an internal Iranian matter. The Iranians have in the past said some things and done something else. They want to have better relations with us, but then they attack our embassies and assassinate our diplomats. They plant terrorist cells in my country and in countries allied to us. They supply militias that want to destabilize countries like Hezbollah and like the Houthis and others in Syria with weapons. They intervene and meddle in the affairs of Arab countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. They support terrorism. This is not the behavior of good neighborliness, and this is not the behavior of a country that wants others to treat it with respect.
Mohsen Milani in London. Trump is also in Israel, and we've heard very similar statements come out from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, as well. Are we looking at the beginning, or actually the formation of an anti-Iran axis with the US, Saudi Arabia, and Israel?
I believe so. I think this is the beginning of, I'm not prepared to call it an alliance, but perhaps a loose, united front against the Islamic Republic of Iran. It used to be that Egypt, under Mubarak, was heading that coalition against Iran, and now I think Saudi Arabia, rich in oil money, has taken the responsibility to confront Iran. The reality of the region that we live in the Middle East, the reality is that Saudi Arabia alone cannot determine the landscape of that region. Iran is not the cause of instability in the region. Iran is simply doing what every power is trying to do, take advantage of the chaos in the region. And as long as Iran and Saudi Arabia do not sit behind the negotiating table and talk, we will continue to have more turmoil in the region. Saudi Arabia, with the help of Israel, or even with the help of the United States, is not going to be able to undermine Iran and to kick Iran out of that region. Iran has already become a major regional power, and the best way to deal with the Iranian threat, as far as the United States and Saudi Arabia is concerned, is to talk to the Iranians. We do have a model that worked. It took about 3 years of negotiation between Iran, the United States, and 6 global powers to produce a nuclear agreement. Why don't we use that model and try to address regional issues instead of threatening Iran or instead of trying to isolate Iran? An isolated Iran, I would submit to you, is a much more dangerous country than Iran that is enjoying economic prosperity, that has been allowed to be reintegrated into world economic system, and that pursues a moderate policy. This is what Rouhani wants to do, and I think it serves American national interests to allow Rouhani to succeed.
Well, Ahmad, what do you think? Because there are two schools of thought in the US, as you know, the Trump school and then the Obama school that wanted the nuclear deal, in a way, to be a springboard into bringing Iran back into the region and the world, but it didn't always work. And, you know, as Mohsen said, people take advantage of instability all around the world. So what do you think going forward is going to be the reaction of Iran if this sort of statements and grouping against Iran continues?
Well, two things. First of all, yeah, as you rightly mentioned, when almost 2 years ago, Iran signed the agreement with the United States and 5 other world powers, it was hoped that the agreement also moderate Iran's behavior in the region. But unfortunately, over the past 2 years, we see that the effect of that has been to the contrary. The Revolutionary Guards has increased its subversive activities in Syria, has deepened its ties with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also playing a negative role in other Arab countries as well. And again, despite, regardless of what Rouhani wants, he has very limited role in these things. The nuclear agreement was successful because the sanctions had made the Supreme Leader to accept a very limited engagement with the West. But both Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards have made it clear that they don't want any non-nuclear engagement with the West, particularly when it comes to the country's missile program and also regional activities.
I just want to add something here. President Trump, as we've been on the air, has said he has been attacking the Iran nuclear deal, calling it terrible for the US after talks with Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. Mohsen in London, you know, the US just before this trip signed off on more sanctions relief because Iran has been complying with the nuclear deal, but Donald Trump seems to want to get rid of it at any turn. Why is he still keeping it, and what would happen if he abandoned it?
Well, I think it is very important for the audience to understand that the nuclear deal was not a deal between Iran and the United States. It was a deal that was signed, among other countries, by China, by Russia, by Germany, by the European Union, by France, and it was approved unanimously by the United Nations Security Council. So if America decides to tear up the deal, I'm afraid that America is going to be isolated in terms of being able to create a united front against the Islamic Republic of Iran. It seems to me that President Trump might not really want to tear up the deal. Instead, he wants to pursue a policy of containing the Islamic Republic, or to put so much pressure on Iran that it is Iran that walks away from that international treaty. And I think the Iranian leadership, from Ayatollah Khamenei all the way down, they have decided they're not going to play that game, and it's going to be the U.S. that might walk away from that important, historic nuclear deal that I think has brought considerable stability in terms of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the region, which is far more important than failed states, terrorism, than every other issue that we face in the Middle East.
Mohammad Marandi in Shanghai. So we have a problem here, don't we? We have Rouhani who wants to be more inclusive, wants to be reach out, and then we have increased rhetoric, strong rhetoric at least from the US, also backed by a $350 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia, talking similar language in Israel. What's likely to be Iran's reaction going forward? What should we look for?
What I think is important is that is something that our foreign ministers just recently pointed out, and that is that the United States seems to be milking Saudi Arabia more than anything else. The Saudis have shown themselves to be highly incompetent, having a highly incompetent fighting force in Yemen. They are fighting the poorest Arab country in the world. They've destroyed the infrastructure. They have created a siege where roughly 15 million people are on the verge of starvation. Cholera has broken out, and of course the United States supports this, not only under Trump but under Obama. And these are of course crimes against humanity, but yet the Saudis have failed to get even anywhere near the capital of the country of Yemen, despite over 2 years of war. Right. So the weapons that the Saudis are purchasing are not really to help the Saudi fighting force. President Rouhani has stressed today in his press conference that Iran will continue to support Syria, Iran will continue to support Iraq, and it will support the people of the region in the face of the extremists. I think, though, what is clear is that Trump, who during his campaign spoke out against Saudi Arabia and who said the source of ISIS actually was the United States itself, he has completely backtracked, just like he has on many other issues as well. So for the Iranians, this is not really something that worries them a great deal. Iran's defense capabilities are quite significant. The Americans know that. The reason why the Americans have never attacked Iran is because of those capabilities. And Iran has very important allies in the region, not only in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Afghanistan. The Afghani government is close to Iran, whereas it has major problems with Pakistan, which is facilitating the Taliban in that country. So when we look at the map, it's clear where Iran stands. It is clear where Iran's adversaries stand with regards to Wahhabism and extremists. Right. And the United States policy is based not on reality, but based on vested interests and financial interests.
Mohammad Marandi, final word, 30 seconds. Can you see anything happening under a Rouhani and Trump term which brings the US and Tehran together like we saw under the Obama administration and inks a deal? Could it be, for example, exhaustion in Syria? Could it be an accommodation in Iraq? Could it be an accommodation over ISIL? Or do you think that they're at loggerheads?
Well, I think it really depends on the United States. In Syria, Iraq, Iran wants a solution. In 2013, when Kofi Annan presented a plan for peace in Syria, it was Iran that supported it and the United States and its allies that rejected it. The doors are open for a solution, but Iran will simply not accept ISIS or Al-Qaeda dominating any part of this region.
Thank you so much. From Shanghai, London, here in DC, that's all we have time for. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, DC. Thanks so much for being with us.